The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the high windows of Bellini's, the most exclusive jewelry store in Paris. Alexander Mercer adjusted his tie as he stepped inside, nodding at the security guard who recognized him immediately. Being one of the richest men in tech had its advantages. Doors opened, people smiled, and the world bent slightly in your favor. "Mr. Mercer, what a pleasure," said Mr. Bellini himself, hurrying across the polished marble floor. "We received those rare pink diamonds you inquired about. Absolutely stunning." Alexander smiled politely. "My wife's anniversary gift. She deserves something special." What he didn't say was how empty their celebrations had felt these past 5 years. How they went through the motions, raising glasses to toast another year together while the empty chair at their table screamed louder than any words they could speak. As Mr. Bellini led him toward the private viewing room, Alexander's eye caught something in a display case, a flash of deep blue and silver that made his heart stop mid-beat. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "That pendant there." "Ah, yes. A unique piece. Just arrived last week. The sapphire is exceptional and the silver work." But Alexander wasn't listening anymore. His fingers pressed against the glass, as if trying to reach through it. The room seemed to tilt around him as memories flooded back. His daughter's 16th birthday, her eyes lighting up as she opened the small velvet box, the way she'd thrown her arms around his neck in gratitude. "This pendant, I need to see it," Alexander said, cutting Mr. Bellini off mid-sentence. The jeweler looked startled but quickly recovered. "Of course, sir." As Mr. Bellini unlocked the case, Alexander's mind raced through impossible scenarios. The pendant had been custom-made, one of a kind. The jeweler he'd commissioned had drawn the design based on a sketch his daughter had made, a stylized wave pattern surrounding the sapphire, her birthstone. When Mr. Bellini placed it in his palm, Alexander felt his legs weaken. He sank into a nearby chair, turning the pendant over with trembling fingers. There it was, the tiny engraving on the back. "To Eliza, forever in our hearts." "Where did you get this?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Bellini's smile faltered. "From a small antique shop in Marseille. I have all the proper documentation, I assure you." "You don't understand," Alexander said, closing his fist around the pendant. "I had this made for my daughter. She was wearing it when she disappeared, 5 years ago." The color drained from Mr. Bellini's face. "Mr. Mercer, I had no idea. I need the contact information for this shop immediately." In the car afterward, Alexander couldn't stop staring at the pendant cradled in his palm. The sapphire caught the light just as it had when he'd first given it to Eliza. He remembered how she'd worn it every day after her birthday, even to swim in the lake that summer morning, the last time anyone had seen her. 5 years of agonizing uncertainty. Police investigations that went nowhere. Private detectives who eventually shrugged and suggested he accept that his daughter was gone. His wife Caroline falling into depression so deep he feared he'd lose her too. Their son James growing angry and distant, as if blaming him for not somehow preventing whatever had happened. 5 years of jumping whenever the phone rang, of scanning crowds unconsciously, always looking for her face, of keeping her room exactly as she'd left it, dust gathering, on her books and stuffed animals, and now this impossible discovery. The pendant that had vanished with her was here, which meant somewhere there might be answers. Alexander made 3 phone calls before his car even reached his hotel, his assistant canceling all appointments indefinitely, his pilot filing a flight plan to Marseille, and his lawyer instructing him to wire whatever amount was necessary to the antique shop owner for information. For the first time in 5 years, Alexander felt something dangerous stirring in his chest, something he'd fought hard to suppress. Hope. Alexander closed his eyes as the private jet began its descent toward Marseille. The pendant sat heavy in his pocket, a small weight that somehow pulled at his entire body. Sleep had been impossible during the short flight, not that he slept much these days anyway. 5 years ago, their family vacation at the lake house had started like any other. Eliza, 16 and full of life, had been excited about starting driving lessons when they returned home. The night before she disappeared, they'd all sat on the dock watching stars reflect on the still water. She'd leaned her head on his shoulder, the pendant catching moonlight at her throat. "Dad, do you think there's life up there?" she'd asked, pointing at the sky. "Perhaps," he'd answered. "The universe is too big for us to be alone." The next morning, he'd woken to Caroline's screams. Eliza's bed was empty, the back door unlocked. They found her towel on the dock, but no other sign of her. She loved early morning swims, had told them once it felt like having the whole world to herself. The search began immediately. Local police dragged the lake. Nothing. Search dogs followed her scent to the water's edge, then lost it. Helicopters scanned the surrounding forest. Nothing. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Alexander hired the best private investigators money could buy. He offered a $5 million reward for information. He appeared on national television begging for help. The case made headlines across the country, then gradually faded from public interest, as these stories always do. But not for Alexander. Not for Caroline, who stopped eating, who stared out windows for hours, who finally moved into the guest bedroom because she couldn't bear to sleep beside him anymore, as if his presence reminded her too sharply of their loss. Not for James, their son, who was 14 when his sister vanished, who turned from a cheerful boy into a sullen teenager overnight, who blamed Alexander because it was his lake house, his idea for the vacation, his failure to keep them safe. "Mr. Mercer?" "We've landed." Alexander blinked, pulled back to the present, by his assistant's voice. The young man looked concerned. Everyone looked at Alexander with concern these days, as if he might shatter at any moment. "The car is waiting," his assistant added. "I've arranged a meeting with the antique shop owner in 1 hour." The drive into Marseille passed in a blur of sunlight and shadow. Alexander rehearsed the questions pounding in his head. "Who sold you? The pendant? When? Did they say anything about where they got it? Did they mention a girl?" The antique shop was tucked away on a narrow side street, its windows dusty and crowded with old clocks and tarnished silver. The bell above the door jangled as Alexander entered, ducking his head under the low doorframe. An old man looked up from behind the counter, eyes widening as he recognized the face of one of the world's wealthiest men. "Monsieur Mercer," he said, in accented English. "What an honor. I was surprised to receive your lawyer's call." Alexander didn't waste time on pleasantries. He placed the pendant on the counter between them. "You sold this to Bellini in Paris," he said. "I need to know who sold it to you." The old man's fingers hovered over the sapphire. "Beautiful piece, yes, I remember it well." "Who sold it to you?" Alexander repeated, his voice tight. "An elderly woman, perhaps 75, 80 years old. She said it belonged to her granddaughter, who had passed away." Alexander's heart sank. "Did she give a name? An address?" "No name. No address." The old man hesitated. "But she mentioned she lived near the lighthouse at Pointe Rouge." "And when was this?" 3 months ago. Perhaps 4. I have the paperwork somewhere." As the old man shuffled through a filing cabinet, Alexander stared at the pendant. His mind raced with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. A dead granddaughter? Was the old woman lying? Had someone found Eliza's body and taken the pendant? Or had she sold it herself? No, Alexander refused to believe that. Eliza would never have willingly parted with it. Something had happened to her 5 years ago, something that had separated her from the pendant only recently. "I need to find this woman," Alexander said, more to himself than to the shopkeeper. The old man looked up from his papers, eyes suddenly kind. "When we lose someone we love, monsieur, sometimes it is better to let go." Alexander met his gaze steadily. "My daughter isn't dead." The word surprised even him. After years of uncertainty, of gradually losing hope, something had shifted inside him. The pendant was proof. Somewhere out there was a thread that connected to Eliza, and he would follow it wherever it led. "I'm not letting go," he said, picking up the pendant. "Not yet." The lighthouse at Point Rouge stood tall against the darkening sky, its beam sweeping across the water in slow, steady pulses. Alexander watched it from the window of his rented car, hands gripping the steering wheel though the engine was off. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes gathering his courage. "Sir?" His private investigator, Roy, tapped on the window. "I've asked around at the cafe. 3 elderly women live near the lighthouse, all within walking distance." Alexander stepped out of the car, the sea breeze catching his jacket. 3? "Yes. I have their addresses." Roy handed him a small notepad. "The first one is just down this road." They walked in silence, gravel crunching beneath their shoes. Alexander had hired Roy 5 years ago when Eliza first disappeared. The man had worked tirelessly for months before gently suggesting they might never find answers. Now, his weathered face showed cautious optimism. "Remember," Roy said quietly, "don't get your hopes up too high. This could be nothing." Alexander nodded, but hope had already taken root, growing stronger with each step. The cottage they approached was small but well kept, with blue shutters and potted flowers along the walkway. An elderly woman answered their knock, her face creasing with suspicion at the sight of 2 strangers. "Madame Dupont?" Roy asked in French. She nodded, eyes darting between them. Roy explained their purpose, showing her a photo of the pendant. She squinted at it, then shook her head. "Never seen it before," she said, and closed the door. The second house belonged to a woman who had lived by the sea her entire life. She invited them in for tea, examined the pendant with interest, but ultimately couldn't help them. "Such a beautiful piece," she said. "I would remember if I had seen it." By the time they reached the third house, the sun had set completely. It was the smallest of the 3, set back from the road behind a wild garden. No lights shone from within. Maybe no one's home, Roy said, but knocked anyway. They were turning to leave when the door creaked open. A thin woman with silver hair stood in the shadows, one hand clutching her cardigan closed at her throat. "Madame Laurent?" Roy asked. She nodded once, eyes wary. Roy showed her the photo of the pendant, explaining again their reason for coming. As she looked at the image, Alexander saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, then fear. "I know nothing of any pendant," she said, her voice firm despite a slight tremor in her hand. "You have made a mistake." She began to close the door, but Alexander stepped forward. "Please," he said, speaking French for the first time. "My daughter was wearing this pendant when she disappeared 5 years ago. If you know anything, I cannot help you." The door closed with finality. Alexander stood motionless, staring at the peeling paint. He had seen the look in her eyes. She was lying. "Let's go back to the hotel," Roy suggested. "We can try again tomorrow." Alexander shook his head. "No. She knows something." He knocked again, louder this time. No answer. Again. Finally, the door opened a crack. "Please leave," Madame Laurent said, "before I call the police." "I'll leave when you tell me the truth," Alexander replied calmly. "I saw your face when you looked at the photo. You've seen this pendant before?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, tears filled the old woman's eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me understand." She glanced past him, as if checking to see if anyone else was watching, then opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly." The inside of the cottage was cluttered but clean. Photographs lined the walls, mostly of an elderly man Alexander assumed was her late husband and a young woman with a bright smile. "My granddaughter, Natalie," Madame Laurent said, following his gaze. "She died 8 years ago. Leukemia." Alexander felt a stab of sympathy, but couldn't see how this connected to Eliza. "The pendant," he prompted gently. Madame Laurent sank into an armchair, suddenly looking every one of her years. "5 years ago," she began, voice barely above a whisper, "I found a girl on the beach. Early morning I was collecting shells. She was half in the water, unconscious. I thought she was dead at first. Alexander's heart pounded so hard he could barely hear. She was wearing the pendant? He asked. The old woman nodded slowly. She was alive, but... She tapped a finger against her temple. Empty. No memory. No identification. Nothing but that beautiful necklace. What did you do? Roy asked. What could I do? I brought her home. I called Dr. Thomas, who has known me all my life. He said she needed a hospital, but... She looked down at her hands. I begged him to let me care for her. Just for a little while. I had been so alone since Natalie died. Alexander felt the room spinning around him. Where is she now? He managed to ask, his voice strangled. Where's the girl you found? Madame Laurent looked up at him, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I called. Her Claire, she said, and a year ago she left for Paris to study art. I haven't seen her since. Alexander sat at Madame Laurent's small kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold between his hands. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Start from the beginning, he said, his voice barely steady. Please, tell me everything. Madame Laurent nodded, gathering her thoughts. The investigator, Roy, had pulled out a small recorder with her permission. It was June, she began. 5 years ago. I walk on the beach every morning at sunrise. That day the tide was unusually high. That's when I saw her, just a shape at first where the water met the sand. She paused, glancing at Alexander. His knuckles were white around the teacup. I thought it was driftwood, but then I saw an arm. She was face down, half in the water. I ran to her, turned her over. She was breathing, thank God, but unconscious. Her clothes were torn and she had a cut on her forehead. And the pendant? Alexander asked. Yes, she was wearing it. I noticed because it was so beautiful against her wet clothes. I couldn't leave her there, so I called my neighbor who has a truck. Together we brought her here. My neighbor wanted to call the police, but she looked down, shame crossing her face. I was lonely. My husband gone 10 years by then. My granddaughter 3. The girl reminded me of Natalie. Something in her face. I convinced my neighbor to wait, just until she woke up. Alexander leaned forward. And when she did, she opened. Her eyes the next day. Beautiful eyes, but empty. No recognition, no understanding. Dr. Thomas said she had amnesia from the head injury. No ID in her pockets. Nothing but that necklace. Why didn't you report finding her? Roy asked, his tone careful. Madame Laurent's eyes filled with tears. I told myself I would once she was better. Days passed, then weeks. She was like a newborn, learning everything again. I called her Claire after my mother. I told the few neighbors who asked that she was a distant relative's child, sent to me after a family tragedy. Alexander's throat tightened. For 5 years, you kept her here? My daughter? The old woman flinched at his tone. I didn't know she was your daughter. I didn't know she was anyone's daughter. She didn't remember. Did she ever recover her memory? Roy asked. Bits and pieces. Sometimes she would stare at something. A fork, a bird, a color, and get a strange look. She would say it reminded her of something, but couldn't say what. The doctor said memories might return in time or might never come back. And the pendant? Alexander asked. Did she ever speak of it? She treasured it. Wouldn't take it off for 2 years. Then one day she looked at it as if seeing it for the first time and said, "Someone important gave this to me." That was all. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, pain washing over his face. I taught her what I could, Madame Laurent continued. She was smart, picked things up quickly. She loved to draw, spent hours sketching the lighthouse, the sea. Last year she said she wanted to study art in Paris. The old woman stood suddenly, moving to an old cabinet. She returned with a sketch pad, handling it to Alexander. These are hers, she said softly. Alexander opened it with trembling hands. The drawings inside were beautiful. Landscapes, objects, faces. He turned the pages slowly until he froze. There, drawn in careful detail, was their lake house, and another page showed a man's face. His own face, though younger, less lined with worry. She was remembering. He whispered, Madame Laurent nodded. I think so. She didn't know what she was drawing, said the images just came to her. When she decided to go to Paris, I gave her my savings. She promised to pay me back, left the pendant as... She hesitated. As a guarantee. And you've had no contact since? Roy asked. She wrote twice. The last letter came 3 months ago. She said she'd found work at a cafe near her art school, was doing well. Said she would come visit when she had enough saved to repay me. The old woman's voice broke. I needed money for my heart medicine. That's why I sold the pendant. I never thought... Alexander stood abruptly, pacing the small room. I need her address in Paris. I need to find her now. I have her letters, Madame Laurent said, rising shakily. The address is there. As she shuffled to another room, Alexander turned to Roy. Could it really be her after all this time? Roy looked at the sketch pad, at the drawing of the lake house. How would she know what your house looks like if she hadn't been there? Alexander touched the drawing gently. I need to see her myself. But I can't tell Caroline or James yet. Not until I'm sure. It would destroy them if this turned out to be false hope. Madame Laurent returned with 2 envelopes, handing them to Alexander with shaking hands. Will you punish me? She asked, her voice small. Call the police? Alexander looked at this elderly woman who had found his daughter, saved her life, cared for her when she had nothing. You should have reported finding her, he said quietly. You should have tried to find her family. The old woman nodded, tears falling. I know, but she became my family. I think I loved her too much to risk losing her. Alexander understood that feeling all too well. The same love had kept him searching for 5 years. I don't want to punish you, he said finally. I just want to find my daughter. He opened the first letter, scanning it quickly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, not the neat script Eliza had been taught in school. But the words sparked hope within him. She's in Paris, he said to Roy, at an art school in Montmartre. We leave tonight. As they prepared to go, Madame Laurent caught Alexander's arm. If you find her, when you find her, please tell her I'm sorry, and that I love her still. Alexander nodded, understanding the complicated grief in her eyes. He was going to find Eliza, his daughter. But in doing so, this woman would lose Claire, hers. Paris welcomed Alexander with rain. Heavy drops pattered against the windows of his hotel suite as he stared at the address in his hand. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times during the flight that it was starting to tear at the creases. The art school opens at 9, Roy said, checking his watch. That's 3 hours from now. Alexander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He hadn't slept. How could he? Somewhere in this city was a young woman who might be Eliza. His Eliza, who he'd thought was gone forever. We should eat something, Roy suggested. Keep our strength up. But Alexander couldn't think about food. He picked up the small photo frame he'd brought from home, Eliza on her 16th birthday, the sapphire pendant gleaming at her throat, her smile wide and carefree. That was the last photo they'd taken of her, just 2 months before she disappeared. He compared it to the photograph Madame Laurent had given him, a young woman with the same eyes, the same curve to her mouth, but with shorter hair and a more guarded expression. 5 years had changed her, but it was unmistakably the same person. What if she doesn't remember me? He asked quietly. Roy looked up from his coffee. The doctor I spoke with last night said memories can return when triggered by familiar faces or places, but he also said not to expect too much too quickly. And, if she never remembers, then you build new memories, Roy said simply. The rain stopped as they made their way to Montmartre. The art school was housed in an old building with large windows that flooded the interior with light. A woman at the front desk looked up as they entered. Can I help you? We're looking for a student, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. Her name is Claire Laurent. She would have enrolled within the past year. The woman's fingers tapped at her keyboard. I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name currently enrolled. Alexander felt a wave of disappointment. Could she be using another name? Eliza Mercer, perhaps? More tapping. Another shake of the head. She might not be a full-time student, Roy suggested. Maybe she just takes classes occasionally? You could check with Professor Dubois. He teaches the evening workshop classes that are open to the public. His office is down the hall, third door on the right. Professor Dubois was a tall man with paint-stained hands and kind eyes. He looked at the photograph Alexander offered. Ah, yes. Elise. Talented girl. Not a full-time student, but she comes to the evening workshops. Mostly works in charcoal and watercolors. Elise? Alexander repeated. Not Claire? The professor shrugged. She introduced herself as Elise. I don't ask questions. Many artists use different names. When was she last here? Roy asked. Last week. Tuesday's workshop. Do you know where we can find her? Alexander asked, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. Professor Dubois hesitated. I don't give out personal information about my students. Please, Alexander said. I believe she's my daughter. She went missing 5 years ago. We've been searching for her ever since. The professor studied Alexander's face, then looked again at the photograph. There is a cafe where many of my students go after class. La Plume. She works there part-time. That's all I can tell you. Alexander thanked him, hope rising again. They found the cafe easily, a small place with outdoor tables and a view of the street. Inside, a few morning customers sat with coffees and pastries. Can I help you? The man behind the counter asked. Alexander showed him the photograph. Do you know this young woman? We were told she works here. The man nodded. Elise? Yes, she works evenings mostly, not scheduled today. Do you have her address? It's very important I find her. The man frowned, suspicious. Who's asking? Alexander took a deep breath. I'm her father. She went missing years ago. I've only just found a lead that she might be here in Paris. The man's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. I can't give out her address. But I can tell her you were looking for her when she comes in tomorrow. Tomorrow? I've waited 5 years, Alexander said, his voice rising. I can't wait another day. Sir, I understand, but does she have friends here? Roy cut in smoothly. Someone who might know where she lives? The man seemed to consider this. There's a gallery down the street, Petit Oiseau. She has some drawings displayed there. The owner might know more. The gallery was tiny, tucked between a bookshop and a bakery. Despite its size, it was bright and welcoming. A woman with glasses and gray hair looked up as they entered. Welcome to Petit Oiseau. Are you interested in our student exhibition? Actually, Alexander said, we're looking for one of your artists. Elise, the woman smiled. Ah, Elise, one of our most promising new talents. Her work is just over here. She led them to a wall where several framed drawings hung. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. There, rendered in delicate charcoal, was his wife Caroline's profile. Another drawing showed a lakeside dock. There, dock, with a small figure sitting at the edge. These are her memories, he whispered. Pardon? The gallery owner asked. Nothing. They're beautiful. Do you know where we can find her? I'm sorry, I don't have her home address, but she mentioned she goes to the river to sketch every morning. The Seine near Notre Dame. She likes the light there at sunrise. Alexander checked his watch. Mid-morning now. Had they missed her? Thank you, he said, already turning toward the door. Wait, the woman called. If you see her, tell her the good news. Her landscape sold yesterday. They hurried to the river, checking every bench, every spot where someone might sit to sketch. After an hour, Roy suggested they split up to cover more ground. Alexander walked along the riverbank alone, scanning every face. The sun broke through the clouds, making the water sparkle. He was about to turn back when he spotted a young woman sitting on a low wall, sketchbook in hand. His heart seemed to stop. Even from a distance, he knew. The tilt of her head as she concentrated. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear. He approached slowly, afraid that if he moved too quickly, she might vanish like a mirage. When he was just a few feet away, She looked up, startled by his shadow falling across her drawing. And there she was. Older. Changed. But her eyes, they were the same eyes that had looked up at him from a crib, that had sparkled with tears at her first bicycle fall, that had rolled in teenage exasperation at his dad jokes. "Eliza," he said, her name catching in his throat. She frowned, confusion crossing her face. "I'm sorry, you must be mistaken. My name is Elise." "No," Alexander said gently. "Your name is Eliza Mercer. You're my daughter. And 5 years ago you disappeared from our lake house." She stood abruptly, gathering her things. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please leave me alone." "The pendant," Alexander said quickly. "A sapphire pendant with silver filigree work. I had it made for your 16th birthday. You were wearing it the day you disappeared." Her hand went instinctively to her throat where the pendant would have been. That small gesture gave Alexander hope. "How do you know about my necklace?" "Because I gave it to you," he said softly. "Because I've been looking for you for 5 years. Because I never stopped hoping I'd find you." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face. Something flickered there. Not recognition exactly, but something close. Uncertainty. Wonder. Fear. "I don't remember you," she said finally. "I know," Alexander replied. "But I remember you. Every day of your life. And I'm hoping that someday you might remember too." They sat at a small cafe by the river, two strangers connected by a past only one of them remembered. Elise, or Eliza, as he called her, stirred her coffee slowly, not meeting his eyes. "You really believe I'm your daughter?" she asked. Alexander nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know you are. The woman who found me, Madame Laurent, she said I was washed up on the beach, nearly drowned." "You disappeared from our lake house," Alexander explained gently. "We thought you went for an early morning swim like you often did. We searched the lake, the woods, everywhere. But how would I get from a lake to the ocean? It doesn't make sense." Alexander had been wondering the same thing. The lake connects to a river. The river eventually reaches the sea. It seems impossible, but here we are, she finished. She looked up at him finally, studying his face. Alexander could see she was searching for something. Any flicker of recognition, any feeling of familiarity. "I have photos," he said, pulling out his phone. "Of you, of our family." He showed her pictures from her childhood. Birthday parties, family vacations, school plays. She looked at each one carefully, her expression a mix of curiosity and confusion, as if viewing the life of someone else. "That's really me?" she asked, pointing to a photo of a laughing teenager at a piano recital. "Yes. You played for 8 years. You were wonderful. I don't play anymore." She paused. "But sometimes when I hear piano music, it makes me feel something, like an echo." Alexander's heart leapt at this small connection. "What else do you remember? Anything at all?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair, a gesture so familiar it made Alexander's chest ache. "Not memories exactly, more like feelings or impressions. Sometimes I dream about water, not the ocean, but still water surrounded by trees. I guess that could be your lake." She hesitated. "And sometimes faces come to me when I'm drawing. I don't know who they are, but I feel like I should. Like the woman in your gallery drawing." "That's your mother, Caroline." Elise looked startled. "Really?" "I drew her from a dream. I thought I made her up." A waiter stopped by their table. Elise ordered another coffee with the easy confidence of someone who had adapted to life in Paris. Alexander marveled at her resilience. Despite everything, she had built a life for herself, found work, pursued art, made connections. "Tell me about your family," she said when the waiter left. "My family, I mean, if what you're saying is true." "Your mother's name is Caroline. She teaches music at a university. You have a younger brother, James. He's 19 now in his 2nd year of college." Alexander's voice softened. "They never gave up hope of finding you, but it's been hard. Very hard." "Do they know you're here?" That you found me? Alexander shook his head. I didn't want to tell them until I was sure. And until you were ready. What if I'm never ready? She asked quietly. What if I never remember? It was the question that had haunted Alexander since he'd first seen the pendant in Paris. What if he found her? But she remained forever a stranger. Then we start over, he said simply. We get to know each other again. She seemed to consider this. I need proof. Something more than photos and your word. Of course. We can do a DNA test. She nodded. And I want to talk to Madame Laurent. Again. On the phone. She's the only person I've trusted for the past 5 years. That's fair, Alexander agreed, relief washing over him. She wasn't running away. It was a start. They made arrangements to meet the next day at a medical facility for the DNA test. As they parted, Alexander resisted the overwhelming urge to hug her. She wasn't ready for that. Maybe she never would be. Back at his hotel, he called Roy, who had continued investigating from his end. I've been looking into how she could have traveled from the lake to the sea, Roy said. There was a record-breaking storm the night she disappeared. Flooding. The lake level rose nearly 2 feet overnight. She could have been carried downstream, Alexander murmured. It's possible. Unlikely, but possible. The lake drains into Miller Creek, which feeds into the Carson River, which eventually reaches the sea. It's over 200 miles, but if she was unconscious, floating on something, a miracle, Alexander said. Or incredible luck. Either way, if the DNA confirms it's her, you've found your daughter against all odds. After hanging up, Alexander stood at the window of his hotel room, looking out at the Paris skyline. The city where his daughter had been living all this time, just a plane ride away. The coincidence of finding her pendant in that jewelry store, it seemed like the hand of fate. His phone rang. It was Elise. I've been thinking, she said without preamble. Those drawings I did, of the lake, of the woman you say is my mother, I drew them before I met you. Before anyone told me about my past. Yes, Alexander said, his heart racing. That has to mean something, right? That somewhere, deep down, I remember. I believe it does. A pause. Then, can you tell me about the day you gave me the pendant? You said it was for my 16th birthday. Alexander closed his eyes, the memory washing over him. It was a surprise. You'd sketched a design months earlier, just doodling in your notebook. I took the sketch to a jeweler without telling you. When you opened the box, you gasped. You said it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. And then what? You hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. You wore it every day after that. Even, he swallowed hard, even the day you disappeared. The line was quiet for so long Alexander thought she'd hung up. I remember, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. Not everything. Just a fragment. But I remember the box, blue velvet, and feeling so happy I thought my heart would burst. Alexander sank onto the edge of the bed, tears filling his eyes. That's right, he said. Blue velvet. I need time, she said, to process all this, but I think I want to remember. Even if it's painful. I want to know who I really am. Take all the time you need, Alexander told her. I've waited 5 years. I can wait a little longer. After they hung up, Alexander finally allowed himself to hope. Not just that he'd found her, but that someday, somehow, she might truly come home. 1 month later, Alexander stood in the arrivals terminal at the airport, heart pounding. Beside him, Caroline gripped his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. What? If she doesn't like me? Caroline whispered, fear etched across her face. She will, Alexander assured her, though his own stomach was in knots. The DNA test had confirmed what Alexander already knew in his heart. Elise was Eliza, their daughter. The news had sent shockwaves through the Mercer family. Caroline had collapsed into tears, cycling through disbelief, joy, and anxiety. James had stared at the photo of his sister, now a grown woman, with confusion and cautious hope. The reunion wasn't simple. Eliza, who still preferred to be called Elise, had needed time. She spoke daily with Alexander by phone, asking questions about her childhood, her life before the accident. Each conversation seemed to unlock tiny fragments of memory. A favorite book, the color of her bedroom walls, the name of a childhood pet. But she was still in many ways a stranger, a young woman with 5 years of life and experiences her family knew nothing about. "There she is," Alexander said, spotting her walking through the arrival gate. She wore a blue dress and carried a small suitcase. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, revealing the face that had haunted Alexander's dreams for 5 years. She spotted them and hesitated, suddenly looking very young and uncertain. Alexander and Caroline waited, letting her come to them. They had agreed not to rush her, not to overwhelm her with expectations. She approached slowly, eyes moving from Alexander to Caroline. "Hello," she said simply. Caroline made a small sound in her throat, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Hello. Elise. You can call me Eliza," she said softly. "I've been practicing with the name. It feels right somehow." They stood awkwardly for a moment, none of them quite knowing what to do. Then Caroline opened her arms slightly, a question in the gesture. Eliza stepped forward and allowed her mother to embrace her. It was brief, a bit stiff, but it was a beginning. The drive home was filled with careful conversation. Eliza looked out the window at the familiar yet unfamiliar landscape. "Anything look familiar?" Alexander asked gently. "Maybe," she said. "It's strange. Like déjà vu, but stronger." At the house, James was waiting on the porch. He had grown from the lanky 14-year-old of Eliza's last memories into a tall young man. When he saw his sister, his carefully composed expression crumbled. "Hey, Squirt," Eliza said suddenly, the childhood nickname coming from nowhere. James froze, then broke into a wide smile. "You remember that?" It just came out," she said, looking surprised herself. That first evening was filled with careful conversations and photographs spread across the living room floor. Eliza studied each one, occasionally pausing at an image that stirred something within her. "This was my room?" she asked, looking at a photo of a bedroom with blue walls and bookshelves stuffed with novels. "Yes," Caroline said. "It's still the same. We never changed it." Eliza nodded slowly. "Can I see it?" The room was like a time capsule. Posters on the walls, books arranged. On shelves, a collection of small glass animals on the windowsill. Eliza walked in slowly, her fingers trailing over the desk, the bedspread. "I remember this," she said, picking up a small glass dolphin. "Dad brought it back from a business trip to Florida." Alexander nodded, throat tight. "You collected them?" "One from every place we visited." Eliza placed the dolphin back carefully and sat on the edge of the bed. "It's strange. I know this was my life, but it feels like someone else's story." "It will take time," Caroline said from the doorway. "There's no rush." That night, after Eliza had gone to bed in her old room, Alexander and Caroline sat in the kitchen, emotions finally spilling over. "She's really home," Caroline whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After all this time." "She's different," Alexander said. "She's been through so much we don't know about. We need to give her space to be who she is now." Caroline nodded. "I know. I just keep wanting to hold her, to make sure she's real." 6 months passed. Eliza stayed, slowly reintegrating into the family. There were hard days when the gap of 5 lost years seemed unbridgeable, days when she felt like an outsider in what should have been her home. But there were also breakthroughs, the day she remembered the password to her old computer. The afternoon she found herself automatically turning down the correct street on a drive. The morning she woke from a dream with a complete, vivid memory of her 10th birthday party. She continued her art, converting the old garden shed into a small studio. Her work evolved, moving from fragments of memory to more complete visions of her past and present merging together. One evening, a year after her return, Alexander found her in the studio, working on a large canvas. It showed the lake house at sunset, the dock extending into still water and 4 figures silhouetted against the golden light. A family, whole again. "It's beautiful," he said from the doorway. Eliza smiled. "I've been thinking about what happened. How I ended up in the ocean." Alexander waited, giving her space to continue. "I remember going for a swim that morning. I remember the water being cold." She paused, brow furrowed in concentration. "There was a storm coming, but I thought I had time. The water got rough suddenly. I hit my head on something, a rock maybe, or driftwood. That's where it goes blank." Alexander nodded. Experts had pieced together the likely scenario. The unprecedented storm, the rising water levels, the powerful currents that could have carried an unconscious body far downstream. "I've been thinking about the pendant too," Eliza continued. "How it led you to me. What are the odds that you would walk into that exact jewelry store in Paris?" "1 in a million," Alexander said. "A miracle." Eliza touched the pendant, which once again hung around her neck. She wore it every day now. Or maybe it was meant to be. Maybe it knew it needed to bring us back together. Later that week, they visited Madame Laurent, who had traveled to see them. The old woman wept when she saw Eliza, torn between joy at her recovery and sadness at losing the girl she had called Claire. "You saved her life," Alexander told her, clasping her weathered hands in his. "We can never repay that debt." "She saved mine too," Madame Laurent replied. "Those years with her were a gift." As the story of Eliza's disappearance and miraculous return spread, Alexander established the Mercer Foundation, dedicated to helping reconnect missing persons with their families. The foundation specialized in cases where memory loss or trauma complicated the search. At the foundation's opening ceremony, Eliza stood at the podium, the sapphire pendant gleaming at her throat. She looked out at the crowd, her family in the front row, Madame Laurent beside them, and dozens of families hoping for miracles of their own. "5 years ago I disappeared from one life and began another," she said, her voice steady. "I was lucky enough to find my way back, to reconnect the broken pieces. Not everyone gets that chance." She touched the pendant gently. "Sometimes it takes a small thing, a pendant, a photograph, a fragment of memory, to rebuild a broken bridge. That's what this foundation will do. Help build those bridges, one piece at a time." Later, as the family drove home together, the pendant caught the setting sun, sending prisms of light dancing across the car. Alexander watched his daughter in the rearview mirror, no longer the teenager he had lost, but a young woman of strength and grace. The years apart could never be recovered. The memories lost might never fully return. But they had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. And in the end, that was the only miracle that mattered.